All right, thank you very much, Derek. So, as Derek said, I'm David Doorey, and I'm a labor law professor up at York University in Toronto. And I know that we have some people listening in who are not Canadians and not Torontonians. So I thought I'd start with just a little introduction to who Sara is and why she's so important to our community here in the city and across Canada. And Sara has, so the Toronto Star, where Sara works, is the largest circulation newspaper in the country. And Sara has become somewhat of a celebrity here in the labor relations community, which I'm sure she never really thought she would become that. And when Jen Harmer asked me to address the graduate symposium for ILERA, I thought that it would be more interesting to do sort of an interactive, what I called fireside chat, rather than have me stand up at the front and lecture to everyone about Canadian labor and employment law. And at the time, I thought we might actually be in a nice room at Ryerson or the University of Toronto, where there would be a nice fire behind us. And of course, the plague has hit us since then, and we are doing this virtual fireplace chat, but I found a picture of a fireplace for the slide there, so we can feel comfortable. When I was floated this idea of a fireside chat, the person I had in mind was Sara, and she's the obvious choice, and thankfully she was available to do it and willing to do it. So I want to say a few words about Sara's work, especially for those of you who aren't from Toronto and Canada. Now I have a few slides here, and really the only reason I put them together is to demonstrate sort of the breadth of Sara's work and the sorts of things that she covers. So I'll just sort of flip through a few of them as I'm talking. Now, I guess what I want to start with is the idea that a lot of you listening will understand as graduate students studying work and labor issues. And that is that studying labor issues and writing about them is not easy. It's not an easy field. And just, starting out right at the beginning with the question of how do you know what to look at and how do you know what to study? There's so many things that you could look at, so many issues to take on. So where do you even begin? And I know Sara would have had to deal with this coming in as a labor reporter, and all of you as graduate students in the field, you're dealing with the same issue. What do I write my thesis on? What do I write my PhD on? Where do I start? How do I do it? And so there's so many challenges that overlap between what Sara, I assume Sara has to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and what graduate students in the field are dealing with. Just things like, how do you get information? Who's going to talk to you? Will they trust you? Will employees talk to you? Will employers talk to you? How do you get hold of information that people don't want you to see? I know that Sara probably spends an inordinate amount of time filing freedom of information request and fighting that process. And as graduate students, we have to figure out our own ways to get a hold of information as well. And the other thing that really strikes me about this field we're all in is that you really need to be multidisciplinary. You need to understand something about a whole range of disciplines. I mean, law, economics, psychology, sociology, history sometimes, geography. All of these things, those of us who are in the field doing this for a living as academics, we all have, these fields all overlap, and we need to learn about all of them to a more or lesser degree depending on what our focus is. So we know how complex all of this is, and some of us spend decades learning it. Seriously, decades learning it. And yet we expect a journalist to be able to walk in and start writing stories about this stuff, and to understand the issues at a high level, and to speak on them in a complex level that really explains the issues, and often without any formal academic training in the field. We'll talk a little with Sara about her background, but I think it's safe to say that Sara doesn't have a PhD in labor studies or any of the things that our audience are studying right now. And so that's a really interesting thing that we expect our journalists to do. But the great labor journalists figure it out, and they do a great job. And what's even more impressive about the great ones, in which I include Sara, is that they're able to take this complexity and translate it into real life personal stories that make the issues real and relatable to a mass audience in a way that us scholars either don't even try to do, or we're not very good at it. In other words, someone like Sara can take a really complicated story about how regulation is failing migrant workers and turn it into a personal piece about actual workers who live this day to day and the challenges they're facing in a way that someone can pick up the newspaper and read and understand the issues in ways that us law professors really struggle with sometimes, writing our 50-page papers on the history of legal regulation. And sometimes we forget, and we could learn from people like Sara as to how to tell a story, right? How to make it real. And so week after week, Sara is pumping out these articles, and each one of them it's just incredible the amount of knowledge that she demonstrates for someone without a background in this field. And so for those of you who haven't read any of her work, I suggest you Google her when we're done and just sit down and pick any story. And some of them are just, go deep in depth, and it's just really incredible. And so I think we're honored to have someone like Sara join us in an academic conference. And so what I want to do is sort of I get to put on the interview hat and flip spots with Sara today, where I get to interview her. And this is going to be a lot of fun for me. And so we're just going to have kind of a freewheeling discussion. I have some basic areas I want to cover, but we'll see. We might end up going off tangent. And I know there's been some questions sent in, and there might be others, and we'll see if we can get to some of them as we go. Okay, so with that long-winded background, Sara, I think maybe it makes sense to really start at the beginning, if we could. This crowd are mostly academics. They're master's students, PhD students. I think we have some other people from the public who have joined in, but I know that your story about how you became a labor reporter at the Toronto Star is quite a meandering one. I recall it starts somewhere with the BBC, but because we're dealing with graduate students, I'd actually like to go maybe even a little further back and talk about where you studied, like how you even got into journalism in the first place, and maybe sort of walk us through that back to sort of what you studied and how you ended up at the Toronto Star.
Sure. Well, I did my undergrad at the University of Toronto, and I did peace and conflict studies. And at that point, I actually thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And I was interested in doing human rights law. And then somewhere along the line, I just sort of decided that, I wanted a job where I had some outlet for creativity. I liked writing, I liked storytelling, and I wanted to have an outlet for that in what I did. But I also knew the field of journalism was really hard to get into. I didn't really have much practical experience. So I ended up doing my master's at the London School of Economics, studying comparative politics, which was a field that I really didn't know anything about. But
I've forgotten that you went to the London School of Economics.
Yeah. So again, didn't have much practical impact on my journalism career, but I sort of just started writing freelance for some organizations in London and just kind of starting to practice writing. I just so happened into an unpaid internship at the time. I lived with a family member and worked at a British news channel for a few weeks. as an intern, and it so happened that the most junior person in the company quit while I was there, and they desperately needed someone to work as an editorial assistant. So again, not really practicing my journalism chops, but it was my first kind of inroad into a newsroom, and I kind of learned from the bottom up how to be a journalist on the job. And after a couple of years of doing that, I moved out to Nairobi to work for a newspaper there for a year, and then got the job at the BBC with the African service. And so I was traveling back and forth from London to a number of different countries around Africa. So all this to say, I had absolutely no experience academically in either journalism or labor studies. But when I saw the posting at the Toronto Star for this job, I had always known that I wanted to come back to Toronto. I was a little bit disillusioned about sort of my previous hopes of being a foreign correspondent, and really questioning and interrogating the role that foreign correspondents kind of play in Western media. And so I wanted a beat that would bring me closer to home, and that's sort of what appealed to me about this job.
And so what was the ad posted? Was it actually the labor and wealth reporter ad?
It was the work and wealth beat, which I had no idea what that meant, and frankly I don't think the Star did either. But I think the general guiding principle was sort of, it was a labor beat, but they wanted to update it. The Star had a long history of labor reporters, but the position had been vacant for a couple of years. The newsroom was constricting because of financial restraints. But they wanted a role to sort of look at the way that work has changed. And traditionally, the labor beat at the Star really did focus on sort of union politics. And I think the idea was really to expand that coverage to focus more on workers. And usually when I describe my beat now, I describe reporting on worker issues. And I think that's probably the best encapsulation of what I do and what other reporters in the US who have, a similar type beat do. That's kind of the spirit of what we do. Mm-hmm. But I mean, my first few months at the Star were really, I remember literally the first day I got there, my editor being like, so what is this beat exactly? What are you supposed to do? And I was like, I have no idea. And it took a lot of kind of flailing around to kind of land on, what my priorities for the beat were. And it took some time to build that out. But, I really did it by spending a lot of time listening really to what folks in the grassroots organizations, the legal clinics, those were really the biggest sort of sources of information for me in terms of how I learned about the beat. And the reason I think that those groups are so important is because, they see the trends, they see the impact of legislative loopholes before anyone else does, before a big law firm, files a flashy class action suit. The folks in the legal clinics are seeing individuals come in and starting to piece together what might become, a picture of something more systemic that's happening. And so they were really key in kind of informing my process of learning about this beat.
That's, so I had a question coming up in my little order, but we're going to jump ahead because you've already addressed it, which is one of the things that's really interesting about your work is that you haven't done historically what labor reporters have done, which, as you said, was a focus on collective bargaining and issues in giant manufacturing plants and the steel mills. And if you go back in time and you look at the labor reporters, that's what they worked. It was mostly men working on men's issues, right? Large manufacturing plants. And as I'm asking this question, I'm going to shoot through some of these slides for for the people watching, just to give you a sense of what Sara writes about. So I'll put a few of them up here, but so this is, Wsib issues you've spent quite a bit of time on, which is, for any of us who are in the field, it's just infuriating dealing with workers' comp issues. And you've really highlighted a lot of those issues that come out. Issues of, here's an example of a legal clinic, one of the legal clinic issues that you're talking about, and the struggles of retail workers and just basic labor standards issues. Migrant workers and the challenges they're facing, long-term care workers. And there's a pattern, injured workers, older workers, younger workers, immigrant workers, women. There's a trend in your writing. And what the trend is that I've always noticed, which struck me just as someone who's been around for a while, that your focus, your beat is primarily people who are outside of the mainstream labor movement. For instance, they have not benefited from collective bargaining. They have not benefited from unions. They depend in terms of law on labor standards and regulation. And yet they're falling through those cracks because the enforcement mechanisms are terrible. Sometimes the laws are terrible. Sometimes the laws are decent on the paper, but they're not being enforced. And that's really where you zoned in. And I thought that was really interesting. And one of the questions I had for you, which you've now started to answer already, was that a conscious choice to really focus in on precarious work and not what we call non-standard work in our academic world? Now, you've hinted that the answer was a little bit when you got to the job itself. The Toronto Star had this idea that it needs to change. But then, so how much of this, the fact that you ended up what your beat is, was that's what you were told to do, or how much of it was once you got out talking to the people in the clinics, you found that's where the interesting stories are?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't told anything when I started. Again, like, I think there was some vague higher level ideas about what the beat would look like, but on the ground, no one really had a concrete vision of what that would look like. So in some ways that was intimidating, but it was also wonderful because I got to carve it out as I saw fit, really. And there was a prior legacy there. Reporters like Lori Montbratton, who's our social justice reporter, had done some wonderful in-depth stories on precarious work. But precarious work really was, as I talked to folks on the ground, the issue that came to the fore, and I was really struck at how these precarious working arrangements impacted every area of people's lives. It wasn't just about being in a low-wage job and not being able to feed your family. It was about, your ability to interact with your community, the sense of isolation that comes along with precarious jobs. And it was about who is more likely to be in precarious jobs. And again, obviously we know that is, it's more likely to be women of color. And so, yeah, it was a conscious decision. It was a conscious decision to focus on the most vulnerable, and to ask how and why our existing kind of regimen, who it excludes and why. And I think it's interesting in this moment where we're having such a reckoning in mainstream media about whose voice is included in mainstream coverage. And so it was, for me early on, a conscientious choice to say, look, I want to use this beat to make space for workers and voices who are not just excluded from mainstream media coverage, but often excluded from policy discussions at the sort of governmental level, who are often not unionized and not a part of the traditional kind of labor movement, as you say. And, I think we're seeing changes on that front for sure. But, I think part of journalism's role and what the power of journalism is to make space for those voices, and I think that's part of our mandate really as journalists.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is a movement within academia as well to shift focus towards the sorts of issues that you're dealing with. And in a way, you would have thought it would have been an obvious thing that we should stop focusing so much on collective bargaining and manufacturing and mining and really look at all the people who collective bargaining is irrelevant to them. And we've always had people talking about that. You know, and in my field, in the law field, for instance, Judy Fudge has been talking about, you know, she wrote her famous paper, Labor Law's Little Sister, years ago, about how really women are mostly left out of collective bargaining, and the only thing that protects them is employment standards, and nobody cares about employment standards. Now you care about employment standards, and increasingly academics have started to look at that, but it's really only recently, you know, and in a way there's an interesting chicken and egg thing here about, at least in Toronto, to the extent to which even your writing has influenced a new generation of people to start being interested in these things, because you were able to take these issues and put them in the public space. If you just, it's an academic thing, so I have to throw in at least one graph, because I know we don't have all Canadians here, but just in terms of context, this is a chart of union density. And if we followed it back even further, what we would see is that private sector union density in Canada has been falling since the 1980s. It used to be up in the mid 30s. And now we're looking at about 15%, depending on where you are, private sector. The blue line is public sector. So in the public sector, unions are still very strong, and the vast majority of public sector workers are unionized. But that's also not an area that you're really focused in on, Sara. You don't have a lot of articles on public sector workers. You're dealing with the private sector. And the private sector is that red line, and it's falling. So right now, about 84% of private sector workers in Canada are non-union. And for most of them, unless the laws change, which is one of the issues you talk about as well, they're never going to be covered by collective bargaining, right? They need a whole other system. And so that story has always been there. Never in the history of Canada have the majority of workers been unionized. And yet in academia, the unionized sector grabbed probably 80% of the attention. And it's starting to change. You know, and I do think that you and others like you who are writing about these stories. I mean, you, for instance, you know, I worked at a legal clinic in Toronto 25 years ago in Parkdale in the labor rights division. And these issues that you're talking about were there then, but there was no strong voice, you know, raising these issues, getting them out to the public. And so there wasn't as much attention on those issues. Okay, we'll come back to some of these points in a minute. I want to ask you, I want to bring in one question that was asked by several people on Twitter last night, and it was also something I was going to ask you, so I'll bring it in. I'll use Jim Stanford's question, which I know you know Jim. Jim Stanford is the director of the Future of Work Center and a famous, if there's such a thing as a famous labor economist, that would be Jim. He says, please ask Sara about the future of labor journalism in Canada. She does a uniquely wonderful job and has exposed so many critical stories, but the labor beat exists almost nowhere else. Why is that? And what can be done to promote and support journalists in that realm? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think since I started this beat, that question has weighed more and more on my mind, because just being in it, I can't understand why an organization would not want someone dedicated to this issue. I mean, obviously, as we're seeing now, you know, I think COVID has really highlighted why it's essential, but, you know, workplace issues, they affect all of us. You know, everyone knows what it feels like to have a bad boss. There are stories that are relatable, they're incredibly important. You know, I think it's a fascinating topic. I I mean, I think that it's been on the decline for a number of reasons. The Star has a kind of historical affinity for this issue. I don't know, some people may not know the history of the Star, but we were founded in the late 19th century by a group of print men on strike from what is now the Globe and Mail. And the initial kind of ethos of the paper was to be a sort of paper for the working person. And that's a key part of our mandate and our Atkinson principles that guide, our kind of editorial vision, the rights of working people. And so it's part of our DNA as a newspaper. And so, for us, I think it's made sense to keep the beat alive. I remember when I first started having a coffee with Lorne Slotnick, who was the Globe and Mail's last labor reporter, who is now an arbitrator at the labor board. But he was essentially shuffled out of that job, I think in the 90s. And I think part of it goes back to who are the gatekeepers, in all institutions, but including media. And I think in a lot of cases, the gatekeepers are people for whom unions are not interesting at the very best. At worst, they're, a threat. They're people who may not have, almost never have lived experience as a low-wage, racialized worker in the workforce. And so there's a blind spot there. I do think that for younger people, we're starting to see a change. When you look at a lot of the kind of digital media outlets coming up in the US, they do have labor reporters or workers who are reporters who focus exclusively on worker issues, HuffPost, Vice, and they're breaking, stunning stories about Amazon, and the gig economy and, all the, major players in that realm. And I think for many of us who have grown up in a world where, it's very difficult to get a stable 9-to-5 job with benefits and a pension, that's instinctively something we recognize as an important story. And so I think we are starting to see a shift. In Canada, it's been a little bit slower, I think, because we don't have the, our media scene is just not as rich as it is in the US, although obviously the industry everywhere is in crisis. But, I was really heartened a couple years ago when the Star expanded and opened some bureaus across the country and sent a bunch of young reporters out there and asked them what kind of beats they wanted to focus on. A number of them chose to focus on labor issues. And so I think we will see a change. I think we will see more reporters starting to focus on this and as part of their daily work.
Yeah, and it could be, and I think you would have played a big part in that. I mean, this isn't going to be like the Sara award show, but almost all of your stories are front page now. I mean, that's just, you've taken a story that used to, a beat that used to be buried in the back and put it right on the front page. And you should be proud of that. And it doesn't surprise me if young journalists coming up look at you as a hero and want to follow in your footsteps. So congratulations to you, but also thank you for all of us, right? Because you're putting what we do out there too, right?
I mean, I rely on the work that you guys do. So.
Yeah. So you've covered some pretty horrible workplaces. A lot of your stories are about horrible workplaces and horrible working conditions. And no doubt Fiera Foods is up there on that list. And so for those of you who are not Torontonians, Fiera Foods is a large industrial bakery in North Toronto. And Sara went undercover there a few years ago. Here's your little story, your front page. It's an incredible piece. A long, in-depth piece. And it's a really interesting story, and I want to just spend a bit of time on it. I know you've talked a lot about it, but what I want to know, a couple of things. One, let's maybe right at the beginning. How did the story come about? I mean, how did Fiera Foods get on your radar, first of all? Let's just start there.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for all the nice things you said. I will say that for every front page story, there's probably 5 stories that were buried somewhere in the paper and editors didn't really care about and probably didn't think were important. And there were dozens of stories like that that led me to the Fear of Food story. So if there is anyone out there watching this who is considering a career in journalism, I would say do not give up on your little 2-bit stories that don't get great play, because that is what lays the groundwork for journalists to cover something bigger. And so I had, I'd heard just talking to workers, interviewing, tons of workers for again, stories that often didn't get great placement. I would hear about the way that the most dangerous tasks in a workplace were often downloaded onto temp agency workers. Obviously, I was covering a ton of stories about the workers' compensation system, and as part of that, kind of began to see how temp agency workers, had particular struggles to get their injuries recognized or to get appropriate time to recover. So that had all started to coalesce in my mind. And then I read a academic research paper out of the US that had looked into, they'd done a statistical analysis that had shown that temp agency workers were, I think, twice as likely to get injured on the job as directly hired permanent workers. And so I wanted to know if the same thing could be said of temp agency workers here in Canada, and quickly realized that we don't keep the type of statistics that allow us to quantify that. And so I couldn't rely on academic research here. So I just began by going through court bulletins that the Ministry of Labour issues when they convict an employer. And I went and read hundreds and hundreds of them and basically isolated all the ones where the worker involved was a temp agency worker. And one of those facilities that was prosecuted and convicted was Fear of Food. And I just remember Googling them, and I found a case on Canley, which is our database of legal decisions that involved the same facility. And it was a horrifying story to me that encapsulated the dangers associated with precarious work. And so just sort of my gut said, I think there's something here. I think there's something happening at this facility that may be an illustration of, the larger problems that we're seeing around temp agency work. And that's how I started digging into it. And I did probably 6 months, if not more, of research before we decided that, given the precarity of the work, the fear of reprisal for workers speaking out, the best way to tell the story was for me to go and get a job there, and that, there was a compelling public interest piece in doing that.
So was it your idea to go undercover?
It was my idea. Obviously, it was, after I proposed it, that's a decision that the final decision comes after, conversations with the STARS lawyers, with, the highest level management. Okay. We had a big conversation about it and decided that, this is the best / only way to effectively tell this story. And there is a public interest here in doing this.
That's interesting, because it's one of the things I wanted to ask you, because for academics, for the students listening, to go undercover, like when we do these research projects, we have to go through an ethics committee. Yeah. And I think I've talked to you about this before, and because I had an idea for a project that kind of stalled. I'd still like to go back to it, but it involved basically trying to get a hold of workers coming in and out of a factory and standing there. And I ran into some ethics issues that just being there could put those people at danger, at risk. And so I had to sort of step back and figure that out. And I was wondering then about your case. So in academia, you've got an ethics committee that will decide if someone could go undercover, and it's very difficult. And I was going to ask you about in journalism or the Toronto Star, what would be the equivalent? So it sounds like there were lawyers involved, and
yeah, I mean, I think the bar for us is obviously much lower than, you know, going through an ethics committee. And obviously there's a long history of kind of undercover reporting to accomplish, you know, investigative pieces. But that being said, it's, you know, it's not a decision we take lightly at all. It is very rare to use it as a tool to tell a story. And really the criteria that you have to convince, you know, your lawyer and your senior editors and managers is, first of all, is there any other way to tell this story? And second of all, is there a compelling public interest to override, you know, something that's a key principle of our profession, which is that we are always transparent about who we are and why we are doing something. So you know, you always identify yourself as a journalist, you always, you know, reach out to all the parties and tell them what you intend to write about them. Those are all key tenets of our job. So we have to really have a strong like that.
right.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt. Sara, I think you might be covering your microphone.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's better.
Thank you so much.
So in terms of the story itself, I mean, it was a long piece, and there's so much information in it. I mean, two things jump out, I think, for me anyways, from the story. And one was the precariousness and complete lack of oversight of the temp worker industry. And then just health and safety issues at this particular plant, how dangerous the place was and how they've been cited before, and yet the problems continued. Which I would say, and I think you've mentioned this, Sara, yourself, in terms of the people listening, I think temp work and even health and safety are two areas that are underrepresented in Canadian academia. At my school, we've tried to hire people in health and safety experts for a long time and weren't getting anyone applying. So that certainly fields that could be looked at. But I think you might have touched on this in your introduction there to the story, but I was wondering how, so it turned into a story, an investigation about the temp industry and the seedy underworld that's involved in it. And I was going to ask you to what extent that was what it started out as. And it sounds like maybe it was really a story about temps at the beginning, or not?
It was definitely a story about temps because I knew through my research, you know, leading up to going undercover, that most of the workers in this facility were hired through temp agencies. And, you know, again, I had a sort of, having read the academic research, I had a bit of a understanding of what the health and safety implications of that often were. And we knew that there was a record of temp workers dying at this particular facility. What we didn't know and was, you know, the extent of the problem. We had no idea about what, you know, as you described, the kind of seedy underworld of temp agencies. That was one piece that we were not expecting. The fact that I got paid I was hired through a temp agency that I never met, that turned out to be an empty unit in a strip mall. I was paid at a payday lender in cash, no pay stub. Those were elements of the story that we did not expect to find, and pointed us to, you know, the broader problems in the temp agency sector in terms of how difficult it is to regulate this. You know, when we dug more into it, we found hundreds of examples of these agencies that are, you know, not real addresses. You know, in one case, one of the registered addresses was an empty plot of land. I found a number of temp agencies that were registered to my own building, One Young, where the Star newsroom is. So I just went up to the floor to see what was going on there, and it was just a reception desk. So, you know, I think that going undercover really was useful in exploring that world, and I don't know that I would have been able to understand that side of the story had I not done that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we could spend an entire hour fireside chat on the Fiera food story alone. But I do want to make sure we don't run out of time and we can get to some of the gig work stuff as well. But I want to, so another question that came in that I think maybe it fits here. Someone asked whether you have ever felt unsafe or a fear for your own safety in your job. Is that something you feel comfortable addressing? And
yeah. Yes, yeah, and you know, I think being a journalist often does come with some risk. There's definitely been in the past, before I was on this beat, you know, I've covered protests that got heated. You know, I covered the elections in Kenya in 2013, I think it was, and you know, there was some very heated moments there. So there's definitely been times where I haven't felt completely safe. I'm very lucky to have received great training on that front, on hostile environment training and all of that. The Fiera food story, again, I remember before I started the job, I interviewed someone off the record who had worked there, and he sent me photos of his injury that he'd sustained, and he'd sliced his finger off. And I remember my first day, like, all I could think about was my finger getting sliced off. And you know, it was daunting, and it didn't, you know, I often did feel unsafe or uncertain about my working conditions there.
You were there for a month?
Yeah, a month.
Wow.
But I think the hardest part was actually sort of the emotional piece of, you know, first of all, I'm forming relationships with people that I'm working with, and I know that I'm leaving. I know that I can leave at any time, really, and they will be staying here and working in these conditions. And that piece was much more difficult than, you know, the concerns around my own safety.
Well, that leads me to another question I wanted to ask you. And I was reading, or I can't remember if I read it or I heard him speak, but it was Stephen Greenhouse, who's the famous labor reporter at the New York Times, was asked at one point whether it's a challenge in his job or how he regulates when you're dealing with a story that makes you angry or sad, like you're just describing, something that's personal. And then you have to write a story, and you have to, by journalistic standards, maintain what he used, the words fairness and objectivity. And I wonder about that. Is that a challenge? So you take Fiera Foods for it. When you went in there, there had already been a few deaths. And then there was another death, right? Soon after your story came out.
Yeah, since I worked there, there have been two further deaths. Yeah.
Right. So as you said, you've got a connection to these people now. Hold on a second. I'll find that story here. Yeah. When you're writing a story like this, is it really hard to just, like, I write on a blog and sometimes I'm obviously being snarky, right? But I'm allowed to be because it's my personal blog, right? But you can't do that. Is it a challenge for you to write these stories and not, or do you even feel you need to not come across as being angry?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think especially right now, because again, we're having all these conversations about how mainstream media has often failed and continues to fail to address, you know, systemic racism and, you know, all of these incredibly painful and infuriating issues. And, you know, sort of asking what is objectivity and who defines that? And for a long time in media, it seems straight straight white man's definition of what is objectivity that has had sort of guided that principle. And there was a great piece by Wesley Lowery, who's a Black journalist who works for 60 Minutes, about sort of rethinking that and focusing more on a fairness and truth perspective on telling stories as professional journalists. And, you know, he says, as journalists, we have to be guided by moral clarity. And for me, that totally resonates. You know, I think journalists have to feel anger. They have to feel empathy. They have to understand why certain issues are so painful. And if you can't do that, you have no business telling that story. So yeah, I mean, I do feel anger and sadness over some of the things that I've seen firsthand. They're incredibly painful. And I think it's wrong to erase that from the reporting. But I do think that ultimately the most powerful way for a journalist to tell a story, you know, our lawyer who's just retired but was at the Star for 50 years, would always say, show, don't tell. And the fact is, you don't need to tell readers what they should be angry and upset about. You present the facts, you describe, and readers get it. You know, they'll feel an injustice. That if an injustice exists, they will feel it through your presentation of the truth. So yeah, I mean, I think that emotion is part of the job. It doesn't diminish your responsibility as a journalist to be fair and truthful. Those are absolutely essential to what we do. I think
columnists can sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Columnists can go off and have a stronger voice. Is that something you'd be interested in? Just writing a column where you can have your own strong voice? Let's say whatever you like.
No, I'm not interested in opinion writing personally. I love the process of investigating and, again, presenting, showing, and not telling. To me, that's super powerful. I don't think my personal opinions are really relevant. I think people want to hear from workers, from people who have the lived experience. And my job as a journalist is to make space for that. It's to, you know, dig for facts that present reality. But I'm not really interested in you know, my own
Right.
opinion on something. You know, there's writers who are great at it and excel at it. It's just not my thing.
Right. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I want to get to this issue of employment status, which is another area that you've spent a lot of time on. And for us, so for me, I'm a labor lawyer, and I've been at this for a long time. And this issue of the difference between an employee and an independent contractor, of course, is as old as employment law. You know, my mentor, Harry Arthurs, wrote about the need for a dependent contractor category before I was born, incredibly. And my first experience was actually when I was a Master's of Industrial Relations student at the University of Toronto in 1990. I got a job helping to organize taxi drivers in Toronto, some 5,000 taxi drivers. And of course, the dispatch company said these are all independent contractors. And then a few years later, when I was a lawyer, I had a case where I represented a taxi driver who'd had his throat slit. And the issue in that case was whether he was entitled to claim workers' comp benefits. And the company said, no, he's an independent contractor. So these issues have been around in the law for a long time. But I think the emergence of the gig economy in really just the last decade has really allowed that issue to become a public issue that people seem to understand. And of course, there you are again, right at the forefront of this reporting in Canada and bringing that issue. And so you've written about the Uber drivers, and then you really dug into Foodora. And so for those of you, let me find it here, for those of you who are not Torontonians, Sara has a podcast out that you should all go download called Hustled on your favorite podcast provider. It's a 6-part series that's now done. So you can listen to all 6 episodes. But this follows the path of Foodora drivers trying to organize a union. Now, how did you get involved in that, by the way? How did you get onto Foodora?
I had a contact who kind of gave me the heads up about this union drive and sort of pointed out why it's so interesting. Going back to our sort of our initial conversation, I'm not focusing hugely on unions. That's not to diminish the importance of that topic at all. It's more to say that, being only one person, I had to make some kind of conscientious choices about where I was going to devote my energy. But, obviously unions are such a key part of looking at decent work standards. And so, this contract had sort of flagged why this was sort of an interesting and innovative attempt to broaden the labor movement and expand the kind of umbrella that the labor movement, the traditional labor movement covers, and sort of an interesting example of organizing, a new way of organizing workers. Mm-hmm. And so that's what appealed to me about this first story here about the start of the organizing drive amongst Foodora couriers, and they've really opened the door to something, and so that's sort of what our podcast focused on, and obviously you were a big part of painting a picture of why this issue is so important. But it's funny. My editors love stories about the gig economy, and it's often a bit of a battle to explain to them that this is actually, it's not new, as many of them seem to think. They see it as sort of a new shiny thing, but it's to me, it's really just an extension of what I've been reporting on for years, which is precarious work.
Yeah.
Just happens to involve now.
Was this the first time that, I think we only have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and, I wanted a couple of short questions I want to ask you at the end, but I'm interested. Was this, because in journalism also gig work has a long history. So I'm just wondering, had you really thought much about this employee versus independent contractor issue before you got into the whole gig economy, or did it suddenly become an issue for you once you started talking to gig workers and couriers?
I've been covering employee misclassification really since I started, and I remember actually one of my first kind of sit-downs with the Workers' Action Center, but one of the grassroots groups pointed out how enormous this problem is. And at that time, we were talking about cleaners, truck drivers, etc. And so I'd done a number of stories on that front, again, when I was doing a bunch of work on temp agencies, temp agencies sometimes tell temps that they're independent contractors. So it had been something that had come up over and over again. And I do think it's such a major feature of the way work has changed, and a major feature of precarious work. So I had some familiarity with the issue, but I didn't have familiarity with how that interacts with technology and how companies kind of use technology as a way to say, like, you're not my employee.
Right. Yeah. So again, we could spend a lot of time talking about Foodora and Uber. There's a new big Uber case coming out this Friday that I assume you're all over. And so for those of you who, again, haven't seen Sara's work, I suggest you go read some of the Foodora. This Foodora story and Sara's podcast are really of interest all around the world. I've had people from Australia who have listened to it and written to me about it. Right. So it's a global issue, and it's really interesting. And there's lots of areas that you could study in terms of academic stuff. And that's really, in our last few minutes, I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions that relate to the students here. And really just the main one I want to ask you, and I don't even know if you have an answer to this, but it's, you've spent so much time on the ground dealing with labor issues now. And I wonder if you could sort of go back, if you could just take a sabbatical and go for a year or two or whatever, and just come back to school and study something. Is there something that you really think would be interesting?
Oof, I mean, so
put you on the spot.
I would love to be able to go redo my master's. Sometimes I regret my decision to not go the law route, and I would love to be, you know, if I were to have a second career in which money was no option and I could go to law school and be a labor lawyer, I think that would be a fascinating job.
I'd go back and be a journalist.
I mean, I think probably if I was to go back and, you know, do a master's thesis or something, I would probably be focusing on health and safety issues for temp agency and migrant workers. I think, you know, one of the first slides you showed was the investigation I did into General Electric and
right.
the cancer cluster that emerged from that factory. And what really struck me about that story was that, you know, obviously those workers had an enormous uphill battle to get compensation for their exposure to chemicals that made them sick, but they also had a union. They also, they were a community of workers that had such a strong bond with each other and had grown up with each other. You know, they were like family, and that was such a huge part of their ability to identify, record, prove that, you know, they were exposed to all these dangerous substances, and ultimately to, you know, to get some form of recognition for that. And it just made me think of all the workers today who 20 years, 30 years down the line will be in a radically different position. You know, if you're a cleaner who has been classified as an independent contractor your whole life, and you've been working with chemicals your entire life, there's going to be no record of you getting sick. You may not even know any of your coworkers. You know, how are you going to prove it further down the line when you start to experience health consequences? And so I think there's just such a lack of data really on things that will have tangible consequences on workers' life later on. And that's scary to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Derek, are we out of time?
Yeah, we are on time now.
Thanks, Sara. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.